And here is Hans Piena on the subject of the history of Dutch painted furniture.
Hello, Hans Piena indeed. I'm curator from the Holland Open Air Museum. And for the last 17 years, I've been studying Dutch painted furniture. Dutch paintings, of course, are famous all over the world. But Holland also produced a vast quantity of painted furniture, of which that is less known. And I will show you some of those pieces today. So we're going to talk about the history of Dutch painted furniture. Based on a thesis I finished a year ago, covering 3 books, one of which is the research itself, the text, and the other 2 is the database of the over 1,000 pieces of furniture I studied, descriptions, a catalog. It took me 17 years, so the total amount of pages is 1,700. So that's 100 pages each year. When I started studying Dutch painted furniture, the theory was that this was made and painted by farmers and fishermen during the winter when they had nothing to do. And they produced their own variety specific for their own village. So the theory was you could recognize painted furniture from a certain region in Frisia, which was different from the north of Holland, etc. Having read all that, I put it all aside. I forgot about all this theory for a while, and I just started to study the pieces itself. I visited all museums in Holland and abroad, Russia, United States. I climbed into people's attics. I visited auctions, and I just had a look at these pieces. What kind of wood it is, for instance. Now, you have this cabinet on stand, which is a typically Dutch piece of furniture. It's wood grained, and if you open it, you will see that it's made of softwood. And surprisingly, 95% of all the painted furniture turned out to be made of softwood, not oak. And if it comes to the construction, it turned out they hardly had any joints. This shows you the most advanced joint that was used in Dutch painted furniture, and it's applied onto the wood, mortise and tenon, secured by a peg. But more often than not, the pieces were just nailed together and had no joints whatsoever, except for a thong and groove between the boards. Studying these pieces, I came across a lot of traces, and I made reconstructions of these traces, trying to figure out what kind of tool would have produced these traces. And this is a typical saw trace that you will find along the boards, and it's produced by a hand saw. On top, in the top picture, you see an 18th century hand saw that was commonly used in Holland. More often, you will find a very regular pattern across the grain, and that was produced by a windmill, a wood saw windmill. And on the right, you see our wood saw that we have in our museum. Started in 1605, thereabouts in Holland, so mechanized kind of sawing wood. On the back of furniture, you will often see this type of pattern, which is produced by a scrub plane to get rid of the saw marks and to smoothen or even out the boards. Now, once the piece is put together, they applied hardware, and having been able to study over 1,000 pieces, I could also reconstruct the whole type of chronology of the hardware that's on there. On top, you see some examples of pivot hinges. The old ones are hand forged and narrower at the end and wider at the base. The modern ones are straight, made from machine-made strips of metal and hollow underneath. In the middle you have a few hinges, butt hinges, the left one being a butterfly hinge, usually just nailed onto the piece with hand-forged nails. In the middle you see a hinge for doors. And on the right, you see the most recent types I found, just a modern butt joint made from machine-made parts, prefab parts. And on the bottom, you see strap hinges used for lids of chests. Again, the older ones are hand-forged and are narrower, thinner towards the end, while the modern equivalent, late 19th century one, is made of sheets of iron having the same thickness from beginning to the end. Same more or less is true for the locks, backspring locks. If you go from top left to bottom right, you will see that the back plates are in the early days trapezium shaped, whereas the modern ones, the 19th century, late 19th century ones, are square. And the early bolts are snap bolts that only pushed in by closing the door itself, whereas the later bolts are moved by a key and a spring. And whereas the top left one is entirely hand forged, the bottom right one is completely produced by prefabbed parts. So the only thing that the locksmith did at that time is combining these prefab parts. Well, gives you a slight indication of how old the piece of furniture can be, if the locks are original, of course. If it comes to the painting on the furniture, I have not found any proof that these pieces have ever been unpainted. They have always been painted. Softwood was regarded as kind of chipboard that should be enhanced, and usually it was done with a wood graining of a more luxurious kind of wood, in this case mahogany. So what you see in this picture is a cross-section of a single mahogany graining, starting from the bottom with the wood cells, and then you have a ground layer already with pigments in it, reddish pigments, and then a thin wash of red pigments being the graining itself, applied with several combs and brushes, and on top you have a varnish. Going through all these pieces of furniture, I have thus established the wood species, the construction tool traces, the hardware, the paint, and usually these pieces are overpainted. I've hardly ever come across pieces that were not overpainted. traces of use I catalogued, and the restorations. So that in that way I build a database. Having this database, I went to the archives to see who could have made these pieces of furniture. And I really looked very well to find farmers and fishermen producing painted furniture. Surprisingly, I didn't find any. It turned out to be a mass product done by specialists in cities. And they originate in peddlers of wooden utensils like buckets or spoons or rat traps, food stoves. And they gradually developed themselves into making small furniture and larger furniture during the 17th century. And they occur only in all the largest cities in the northwest of Holland. So not in villages, but in cities, larger cities. And they developed into the main competitors for cabinet makers during the 17th century. Here is a enumeration of the cities where they occur, starting in Amsterdam, 1614, and gradually spreading out through the whole western, most densely populated part of Holland during the 17th century. And in the 18th century, smaller cities farther away from the South and North Holland also developed guilds for Witwerkers. Forgot to mention that Witwerkers means werker means worker, a craftsman, and wit is white, and that refers to the kind of wood that they were supposed to use, softwood. If you work softwood, it's whitish, and that's why they were called Witwerkers. And here's a little map showing the guilds of Witwerkers throughout the north of Holland. The red ones, this being the 17th century guilds, starting in the most densely populated area, and then gradually spreading out through over the whole northwest of Holland. And that coincides with the biggest cities, with the biggest markets, which enables you to specialize in making one particular kind of furniture. If you would have been a carpenter in a small village, you would not be able to specialize in only making painted furniture. You would have to make wheelbarrows as well, and coffins and all these kinds of things. The guild regulations, I found that state the production of painted furniture, mentioned that these people, these Witwerkers, were only allowed to use softwood, and that was forced upon them by the cabinet makers, because they had the monopoly on oak, the real stuff, the good wood, and they allowed the peddlers to use softwood, which they thought it was inferior, and they hoped they would never become successful cabinet makers. But I will show you how wrong they were. Now, all this softwood should be painted, said the guild regulation. And in Belgium, the Witwerkers were not allowed to use glue, nor were they allowed to make joints. But that has never been the case in Holland. Masterpieces, we'll come across some of them in a short while, were a cabinet and a tea table. And later on, they changed it into something more modern, like a writing desk. Tea table is the model of a tea table I already found on a medieval painting. Of course, they didn't drink tea at that time, but the model already existed hundreds of years before that. And this model became attached to the word tea table around 1680 specialty in Holland. This is a cabinet, and this type could very well be a masterpiece. The description are in the guild regulations exactly apply to this cabinet. It shows the works of Simpson. I'm sorry. He is wearing the doors of Gaza and killing a lion, etc. And this could have been a masterpiece, one of the rare ones I found. Of course, I also looked at the paint recipes, and all the recipes that deal with Witwerkers paint recipes state that often a low quality softwood is used, a chalk ground, a glue size, graining, and then a brownish varnish, which usually contained amber, a brownish resin naturally occurring in sediments in Holland. Going through all these archival material in Amsterdam, I found around 750 records of Witwerkers from 1650 to 1800, boiling down to 476 individual craftsmen, being the masters. The other people that worked in the workshop, not being the masters, were hardly ever counted for. I have hardly ever found any mention of those. So during this rather long period, 150 years, there have always been like around 40 different workshops producing painted furniture. And how did they sell it? This is a picture of Amsterdam 200 years ago, 230 years ago, late 18th century, just behind the big church at the Dam Square. And in the back, behind the lantern, you see the Witwerkers Guild shop, where they were allowed to present their pieces. It was run by the women of the Witwerkers. And if you look closely, you will see blue painted tea tables, classically in a classical fashion, painted in a classical fashion. In the back, you will see a linen cabinet, and in the front, you will see serving tables. But that was their shop. But they also sold the furniture on a weekly market, being the northern market. Here you see a merchant talking to a couple, trying to sell them gate leg tables. One is decorated with rococo ornaments, and the other one behind the gentleman is marbled. And behind the lady, you will see a tea table, marbled again. So sold on markets weekly. And what you see here is not a market. It is someone trying to sell his inventory. If you look closely, it is really packed with pieces of painted furniture. A tea table just behind him, corner cabinets, tea stoves, a gate leg table in the far right. So also at that time, second-hand painted furniture was sold quite frequently. There are other ways in which they sold their furniture. As you know, Holland is more water than land. It's flat, and that enabled a tight pattern of shuttle boats. They not only transported people, but they transported a large variety of goods, and among them furniture. And in the 17th century, you see on the left-hand side, the black lines, that quite some cabinet makers' furniture was transported throughout Holland from Amsterdam. And in the second picture in the middle, and on the right you see black and red lines, the black one still being the cabinet maker's furniture, but the red lines are the Witwerkers furniture, painted furniture. And in the 18th century, two main centers appear, Rotterdam near the coast and Amsterdam, more to the right, distributing all this painted furniture to the fishermen and farmers that were supposed to have produced them, which they didn't. And during the 19th century, Rotterdam declines as a center for painted furniture, and Amsterdam takes over, not only for the cabinet makers' furniture, but also for the Witwerkers' furniture. A huge center, supplying the whole of Holland with furniture. I was lucky to find a record account book of one of the Witwerkers in Amsterdam, being Frans Dircksz Sluijter. He lived in the early 18th century. And here you see one page dating from 1706, describing the tea tables and the tea trays that he sold. It first says how much, and then the size being 3.5 foot or 4 foot. We still measured in foots then. This is prior to Napoleon, who forced us to measure with centimeters. And then you will see a description of the kind of decoration, lacquered with flowers, and then you will see the price of a piece, of one piece of furniture, and the total. And on top, the top line says the client, where he lives and who it is. So that gave me a very precise picture of what that was produced and for whom. It must have looked like this if I followed the descriptions, and I found some pieces that fit the descriptions in this record account book. Now, if we put his record account book into a graph, it covers 14 years. There are 6,600 records in this administration. And in total, in these 14 years, he produced 11,685 pieces of furniture in 14 years. And this man didn't even have a big workshop. He only had 4 workbenches with people working for him. Larger workshops would have 8 workbenches. And calculating this, I estimated that in total 90,000 till 100,000 pieces of painted furniture were produced in Holland each year. Now, quite some of them were tea trays, so that are small pieces, but still it's a staggering amount, of which hardly anything is left. If we plot his distribution pattern, his trade distribution onto a map of Holland, you will see this Frans Dircksz Sluijter in the center in Amsterdam, and he's transporting his furniture all over the place, and even to Germany. You see the longest line to the right, and even not indicated here to Suriname, a colony in the South America. Now, the types of furniture that I came across is, for instance, this cabinet. It's one of the earliest surviving examples I found, 1650, around 1650, based upon the tulips and the tool traces and the constructions and the kind of locks. Very rare. More often you will see, which is shown here on the right. It's a family, and on the right you will see a child sitting in a potty chair. Children for the first 4 years of their life in Holland were pretty much confined to those chairs, tied with ropes, cords, beautiful cords, to the back of these chairs, and they would have to eat and sleep and do everything in these chairs. And you will find back these kinds of chairs in collections. This is a potty chair. It's a doll's potty chair, in this case, dated 1740. Another type of furniture that you come across on paintings is this serving table. From what you see, it would be like marble, but it isn't. It's marbled, it's painted. And a few examples are still present in Holland, like this marbled serving table. This is a nice drawing of done by the artist that you see here, sitting in his own kitchen, Jacob Katz, living in Amsterdam, and he's drawing himself in the mirror. So what you see is what he saw, but then in reflection. And he's sitting at a gate lag table, and there are quite some of these gate lag tables still left in Dutch collections. This is afternoon tea. They couldn't establish whether this is a Dutch scene or an English scene, since in this period there is much trade and exchange between England and Holland, but certainly before Brexit. And it shows a marvelous black polished, highly polished tea table, like it is ebony. This model I found back many a times, but I have never found a black varnished one. All the tea tables that are now in museums have decoration on them, like they collected only the most decorated ones, and they ignored the evenly painted one, uniformly painted ones. And they often have biblical scenes. Here's the head of Cyrus being shown to the queen that ordered this head. Here's a tea tray with the entry into Jerusalem, and it is quite easy to find the prints that served as an example to copy onto this piece of furniture. Now, the prints that they used always came from very cheap print Bibles, and they were used to copy onto the painted furniture. Here's another example. Here's an interior of a manor house with a toddler in the hallway, on the landing with her little cradle. But on the right, you see a corner cabinet, classical style, end of the 18th century. And corner cabinets like that you can still find with its original decoration, being it more yellowed. But this is quite nice piece that has survived quite well. A few subjects I would like to discuss with you, show you. First being this cylinder desk. It's the most famous cylinder desk in Holland. Why? Because it's made for the brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, being Lodewijk Napoleon, our first king, who came in Holland 1805 and started to redecorate the palace at the Dam Square in 1808. And this was produced for him, which was copied for the less wealthy on a vast scale in Holland. I'll show you this example, made of oak with brasses, hardware, not gilt. You should know that at this time, for the first time in the history of Holland, the constitution said that everybody was allowed to vote, that is, every man, not the women, and on a few conditions. First, you were not supposed to be in prison, otherwise you were not allowed to vote. You had to pay a certain amount of tax, so that meant that only the rich could vote, and you had to be able to read and write. Being that so, this made being able to read and write a status symbol, and more people bought furniture that made them appear as if they could read and write. For instance, this piece of furniture, it's a Witwerkers furniture, very cheaply made, and on the outside you would say it is a cylinder desk. Would be in the living room next to the hearth, giving the impression that the owner was very literate. But if you open it, it's not a cylinder desk at all. It's a piece of furniture to store your dishes, and to in the top compartment store your peas and beans and grain, etc., that you harvest from your garden. This looks like a cylinder desk as well, being next to the hearth. And if you open that, it turns out to be a peat box, not another writing desk, but a peat box. So you will find throughout Holland, from this period onwards, pieces of furniture that look like writing desks, but they aren't. They are peat boxes or pieces of furniture to store peas and beans in. Since these people didn't read and write, they probably even couldn't read and write, but they still wanted to appear, keeping up appearance. They wanted to make believe that they could read and write. Now, the funny thing is if you look at the elite that was allowed to vote, wasn't in prison, paid enough tax, and could read and write, if you see them working, they're never working at a cylinder desk. They're always working at a table with green cloth. So the poor or the less wealthy were imitating something that actually hardly existed. That's remarkable. The other subject I wanted to touch upon is authenticity. Now there are a few pieces that are authentic. Authentic for me being meaning not having been overpainted, not altered. They might have aged through time. They might have traces of wear and tear, but they have never been overpainted or modified, remodeled. The majority, however, are painted over in more or less the same way. Wood graining. Quite a few turned out to have been beautified. So originally they had a wood graining, but nowadays they have a fantastic decoration with landscapes, etc. Historically inspired scenes. Quite a few pieces of furniture were marriages of several older pieces. Some of the pieces I found had never been pieces of furniture at all, but they were later produced with old boards. Unfortunately, the majority of the painted furniture in Holland ever produced was stripped in the 1970s, 1980s, because by that time we thought that that was the real authentic farmer look these pieces should have. And unfortunately, I found quite a few fakes, even in our own museum and storage rooms. For example, here you have a gate lag table. The scene that you see is still original, but Around it, you will see that the green, the dark green, isn't original. It's painted around the original scene, and through it you will see the Prussian blue that is original. You can see the same underneath here. And if you make a cross section, you will see that it originally started out to being a blue piece of furniture. Most of the painted pieces in the 1750s, 1760s were blue in Holland because of the Prussian blue, which was very fashionable. And later on, this pieces received several mahogany graining layers, which became fashionable around 1780, 1790 in Holland. And that color you still see on this piece. Another example is this chest of drawers in our museum on display. And it's beautifully painted with all kinds of scenes, sea battles and landscapes with bridges. You make a cross sections, however, of the paintings. There are tons of layers on them, being mahogany graining 4 to 5. And only at the top end, you will see the highly colorful paint layers that are seen, that you can see today, being the decoration on top. So for a large part of its life, it was mahogany grained. And if you study the scenes more closely, you will find that it is a copy of a painting by Rembrandt, being this one, landscape with a stone bridge, copied on one of the drawers. Usually the colors aren't right. I think these people worked from black and white pictures. And these date from, these overpainting, historical overpainting date from 1920, 1930, 1940, mostly. Now this miniature cabinet was bought for quite a lot of money during the Second World War, and it reminds you of the first cabinet I showed you with the little columns in the top of the doors and biblical scenes and lovely bun feet. It was published a lot, and they made lovely drawings, construction drawings of it, to study the construction. But and the scenes were of course studied and thought to have derived from a print Bible prints by Cornelis van Sichem, early 17th century. You can see why they thought that. There is quite some comparison. It's quite some similarities. But when I had a look at this piece, what struck me first was that the biblical scenes were painted directly onto the windmill saw traces, which I've never seen on an authentic piece. They've always first sanded down the saw traces and then started with the ground and then with the decoration. So you wouldn't find any windmill saw traces. I show them here. When you open this little cabinet, you will see that the inner door has a beveled edge, which reminds me of a panel in the frame of a door, not of a single door. A reused panel from a frame door frame. The pivot hinge on the outer door is made of zinc or tin plate, not forged, and it's fixed with wire nails. That's odd for a 17th century piece. On the inside, you will find pencil lines. And pencil lines only occur in Holland after 1820, 1830 or something. And if you open the doors and you look underneath the top, you will find varnish and ink stains. It's quite odd to have ink stains against the underneath the top. if you we röntgened this piece of furniture, and it showed only wire nails, and wire nails in Holland were used after 1860 only. We analyzed the binding media, and it turned out to be linseed oil, but it was not fully oxidized yet. It hadn't dried yet. So it was a fairly recent linseed oil. Now, linseed oil takes 100 years to dry completely, but this piece being already 60 years old, must have been quite recently made when they bought it. How recent? The white pigments in the ground layer on the door showed not only zinc white, but also titanium white, which was produced after 1920. So somewhere after that, the whole piece was made. And when it came to auction, the paint might have just dried. Now we can laugh about this or smile, but by that time, they did not have all this instrumental analysis to see what pigments are on there and what the state of the linseed oil is. So a lot of museums were fooled by antique dealers. I'm sorry to say that. During my research, I found quite a lot of these small cabinets and pieces with all the same models and the same decorations, sold on auctions for vast amounts of money, for being 17th century, which they are not. The last example I will show you is a cradle, which was bought by an antique dealer, which was bought from an antique dealer in Amsterdam. We bought 2 cradles from his business. And this was labeled as Hindeloopen, a beautiful city in Friesland. The decorative style was labeled as Hindeloopen. The biblical scenes I found back in a print Bible. But this print Bible wasn't a cheap print Bible. It was one of the most expensive print Bibles ever produced in Amsterdam, which is very odd because the Witwerkers were on average poor, and the print Bibles that they used were the cheapest print Bibles available. And on this piece you find that the most expensive print Bible was used, which was weird. Thanks to the beautiful books of Bill Cotton, who made inventories of all the Scottish vernacular furniture, we quickly discovered that the model of this cradle wasn't Dutch at all, but was in fact a Scottish cradle from the early 19th century. With the holes at the edge for the straps, everything made sense. So we have an early 19th century Scottish cradle, which was painted somewhere during the Second World War, or somewhere there before that, in an historical, pseudo-historical decoration, and sold as 18th century hindeloopen. For a long time, we believed that it was from the typical for hindeloopen, which resulted in the fact that in hindeloopen they started to reproduce these cradles on a large scale, vast amounts. You can find them in other museums and in private homes. By doing so, Scotland unknowingly and unintentionally contributed greatly to our cultural heritage. So we have, is this hindeloopen or is this Scotland? We decided to call it the Scotlopen culture. Thank you very much for your attention. This was my lecture.
And I would like to say, Hans, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you.